You are watching Starkon International, where history meets mystery, and every story is told with the truth it deserves. Subscribe, and join us on a journey across the moments that shaped our world. In the far eastern reaches of Asia, where the first light of dawn kisses the horizon, lies an island nation unlike any other: Japan. For centuries, this land remained shrouded in mystery to the outside world, a place of towering mountains, sacred forests, and a people bound by tradition, honor, and resilience. Its very name, Nippon, means the origin of the sun, a fitting title for a civilization that has repeatedly risen from the ashes of its own trials. Here, ancient temples stand beside neon-lit streets, and the whisper of the past still echoes in the rhythm of modern life. But Japan's story is not just one of beauty and harmony. It is a tale of transformation, ambition, triumph, and catastrophic downfall. This is the journey of how Japan rose to become one of the world's most powerful nations, and how, in a single moment of fire and devastation, it all came crashing down. Long before skyscrapers pierced the skies of Tokyo, Japan was ruled by the sword. This was the age of the samurai, a warrior class that shaped the very soul of the nation. Emerging in the late Heian period, the samurai were bound by a strict code of honor known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. It demanded loyalty to one's lord, mastery of martial skills, self-discipline, and above all, an unshakable sense of duty. For the samurai, life and death were two sides of the same coin. To live without honor was worse than death itself, and many chose the ritual of seppuku rather than face disgrace. At the heart of this era stood the shogunate, a military government led by the shogun, whose power eclipsed even that of the emperor. The first of these, Minamoto no Yoritomo, rose to power in 1192, ushering in As the 19th century dawned, Japan stood at a crossroads. For over 200 years, the country had lived in isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate. But the world was changing, and change was knocking on Japan's door. In 1853, American warships, known as the Black Ships, arrived in Tokyo Bay, demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. This moment shattered centuries of isolation. And in 1868, the Meiji Restoration began, a turning point that would redefine Japan forever. The emperor was restored to power, and with him came a vision to transform Japan into a modern nation. Feudalism was abolished, railways were built, factories rose, and the samurai class faded into history. In just a few decades, Japan leapt from medieval traditions into industrial modernity. Japan looked outward, learning from the West, adopting technology, education, and military systems. But it wasn't just imitation. Japan blended its traditions with modern science, forging a unique identity, one that would soon astonish the world. By the early 20th century, Japan had become a rising power, strong enough to defeat mighty Russia in 1905. It was the first time an Asian nation defeated a European empire in modern warfare, and the world took notice. Japan had risen, and the age of the samurai had given way to the age of empire. The year was 1868. The centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate had fallen, and a new emperor, young Emperor Meiji, took the throne. What followed was nothing short of revolutionary. Japan, once a feudal land of swords and rice fields, transformed into a modern industrial state within a single generation. Samurai laid down their swords as a national army was formed. Railways stretched across the islands. Western-style schools, factories, and industries emerged, inspired by Europe and America. Diplomats traveled abroad, bringing back new ideas in governance, technology, and culture. But Japan's modernization was not blind imitation. It was a careful balance, blending Western science and technology with Japanese spirit and discipline. The world watched in awe as a once isolated nation rose to stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the age. The Meiji era was not just reform, it was a rebirth, a declaration to the world that Japan would no longer remain in the shadows of history. As the 20th century dawned, Japan had transformed from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial power. But with modernization came ambition. Japan sought not only to catch up with the West, but to surpass it. And to do so, it needed resources: oil, coal, and land, resources the small island nation lacked. In 1904, the world watched in disbelief as Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had humbled a European empire. Japan's victory signaled its arrival as a new global force. The nation's leaders now dreamed of an empire stretching across Asia. Korea was annexed in 1910. Soon, Japanese influence reached deep into Manchuria and China. But this rapid expansion carried a darker side. Military dominance became central to national identity. By the 1930s, democratic voices were silenced, and the army ruled with an iron fist. Japan was no longer just rising, it was preparing for war. As the 20th century dawned, Japan had transformed from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial power. But with modernization came ambition. Japan sought not only to catch up with the West, but to surpass it. And to do so, it needed resources: oil, coal, and land, resources the small island nation lacked. In 1904, the world watched in disbelief as Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had humbled a European empire. Japan's victory signaled its arrival as a new global force. The nation's leaders now dreamed of an empire stretching across Asia. Korea was annexed in 1910. Soon, Japanese influence reached deep into Manchuria and China. But this rapid expansion carried a darker side. Military dominance became central to national identity. By the 1930s, democratic voices were silenced, and the army ruled with an iron fist. Japan was no longer just rising, it was preparing for war. By the early 1930s, Japan's hunger for power could no longer be contained within its islands. In 1931, Japanese troops invaded Manchuria, creating a puppet state called Manchukuo. The world condemned the aggression, but Japan's military leaders saw this as proof that the League of Nations was powerless. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, leading to brutal conflicts like the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands were killed. These events shocked the world, but inside Japan, nationalism burned even brighter. As tensions grew in Europe, Japan saw an opportunity. In 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, officially joining the Axis powers. The dream of building a vast empire across Asia, what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, was now closer than ever. But there was one obstacle: the United States, which imposed crippling economic sanctions on Japan, cutting off vital supplies like oil and steel. Faced with the choice of retreat or confrontation, Japan made a fateful decision. On December 7, 1941, waves of Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In just 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Japan celebrated a stunning victory, believing it had struck a decisive blow. But what Japan saw as triumph would awaken a giant. America declared war, and the Pacific became the stage for one of the most brutal conflicts in history. After Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. It Its empire stretched from Southeast Asia to the Pacific Islands. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial might, was preparing for payback. The turning point came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Thanks to codebreakers, the U.S. Navy anticipated Japan's attack. In a fierce clash, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of its fleet, were sunk. For the first time, Japan was forced onto the defensive. The empire that once expanded with lightning speed now faced a relentless pushback. As the war dragged on, the Pacific became a bloody battlefield. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American and Japanese soldiers fought in desperate conditions. Japanese forces, guided by the Bushido Code, refused to surrender, leading to devastating losses. Kamikaze pilots, willing to sacrifice their lives, launched suicide attacks against U.S. ships, a haunting symbol of Japan's resolve. But the tide was irreversible. By 1945, American bombers reduced Japanese cities to rubble. The once mighty empire was cornered, awaiting a final, unimaginable blow. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood on the brink of collapse. Its navy was shattered, its cities lay in ruins, and millions faced starvation. Yet the military leadership refused to surrender, clinging to the hope of one last stand. Then came the dawn of a new, terrifying weapon. On August 6, 1945, the American bomber Enola Gay released an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. In a blinding flash, the city was obliterated. Tens of thousands were killed instantly, and countless more would die in the days that followed. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Once again, fire and death consumed an entire city. For the world, it was the birth of the nuclear age. For Japan, it was the breaking point. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation. For the first time in history, his people heard his voice as he announced Japan's surrender. The empire had fallen, not by defeat on the battlefield, but by the sheer destructive power of science unleashed. World War II had ended, but at an unimaginable cost, and a scar that would forever shape Japan's history. The war had ended, but Japan lay in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble, industries destroyed, millions homeless and starving. Yet from this devastation began one of the most extraordinary transformations in human history. Under the guidance of the Allied occupation, Japan was stripped of its military power and given a new constitution, one that renounced war forever. Democracy replaced militarism, and freedom of speech and press blossomed for the first time. But the true rebirth came from the Japanese people themselves. With discipline, resilience, and a determination to rise again, Japan rebuilt its cities, factories, and spirit. In just 2 decades, the land once brought to its knees by war would emerge as a global economic powerhouse. The scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained, but so did a new vision, a Japan dedicated to peace, innovation, and prosperity. From the ashes of war, Japan had been reborn, a nation forever marked by its past, yet determined to shape a better future for the world. Japan's history is one of resilience and transformation. From the age of samurai and emperors to the devastation of war and the miracle of rebirth, Japan has walked a path few nations have traveled. It is a story of a nation that fell, yet rose again. A story that teaches us that even in the darkest of times, hope can spark a new beginning. Today, Japan stands as a symbol of peace, culture, and innovation. A nation that honors its past while building a brighter future for the world. This was the story of Japan, a land of traditions, struggles, and rebirth. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Starkon International for more powerful stories from history and beyond.